Good afternoon. It's been an interesting conference so far. Fascinating topics that we've already seen. So starting off, one of the topics that interested me was technical debt that you, Andre, mentioned during the first session. And we've talked about complexity and architectures a bit and the trade-offs between different kind of architectures. And your second talk, you had the challenge of overcoming the after-lunch dip, which you did very well with that. I thought it was great. You started off in black and white, taking us back, looking at organizational enterprise real-life problems and the kind of constructs that you could use. And my talk is going to be building a little bit on that. I think if you look at talks, you could divide them up into sexy talks, boring talks, and scary talks. Now, the sexy talks are all about tools, and I don't do sexy, I'm afraid. Sometimes I do talks about behavior, which are often scary because you get to confront yourself with stuff. But I'm afraid this is one of my more boring talks because it approaches things from the organizational side. But I hope that I'll give you something to take away, some things to think about, because I'm approaching the DevOps world as an outsider, from an outside-in perspective. And if you notice my job title here, the IT paradigmologist, if you're wondering what an IT paradigmologist is, just deconstruct the word. A paradigm is like a pair of glasses, a way of looking at the world, a model. And I like an ology, study. I like studying ways of looking at IT. And DevOps is a new way of looking at IT. It really fascinates me, and I make it my business to observe these kind of trends that are going on, how people are picking up, what kind of value they're getting out of stuff. And I hope it's going to be interesting for you. Bit of demographics. Who does development work? Thank you. For the recording, that's probably about a third to 40%. Who does operations work? Slightly more, I'd say that's 60%. And who does both? Bit of both. Yeah, about half. Yeah, wow. Well, thanks for that. Yeah, interesting demographics there. And who, if you think about your DevOps journey, who'd say that they're more or less at the beginning, in the explorative phase of what DevOps is? Okay, maybe quarter, third, yeah. Okay, well, I started off on my DevOps journey about four or 5 years ago when I came across the term DevOps, and I got in touch with Patrick Dubois, the guy who coined the term DevOps. I'll speak a little bit about our organisation in a minute. I tried to get him to the Netherlands, where I'm based, to speak at a conference, but he was presenting in Sydney one year and in somewhere else the other year. Now, after 3 years, he'd become such a rock star in the DevOps world. He was inaccessible, so I gave up asking him. But we're in touch from time to time. The organisation that I represent, I'm self-employed, but work for half of my time for a not-for-profit membership organisation, where the ASL-BSL Foundation here, where we've collected best practices around application management on the one side, our ASL framework is our collection, library of practices, and what we call business information management on the other side, which is the business's responsibilities with respect to IT. So how do businesses interact with these strange IT people? And it's my job as an ambassador to engage with other communities, like I'm doing today with you, sharing our thoughts on how things are going on in the IT world and seeing how we can benefit each other. These are the two areas I mentioned, and I engage with different disciplines varying from enterprise architecture, business relationship management, lots of IT, do plenty of stuff in the IT service management area, engage with these kind of communities. And I'm constantly trying to build bridges between our community and others. I might go off on a tangent in this presentation. I often do. I've got 42 slides, if you want to keep track of the progress. 42 is a great number to have anyway. Just for the nerds. The DevOps, is it just another hype? And if so, we should kill it. It's called kill DevOps. But I think before we kill it, we should, what are we actually killing? I'd like to spend a little while defining DevOps and hopefully contributing by defining it to people who are still in the explorative phase. You seem to have clustered together, but you're clearly birds of a feather. But before we define it and kill it, or before we kill it, I'd like to expand the concept of DevOps, which is often taken in quite a limited context. I think there's much more value if you expand it a bit more. And before we finally kill it, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the value in DevOps and how you sell the concept to executive management. Because it's often, in general, it's often a challenge for IT people to sell the great stuff, to communicate the great stuff that they do in terms that executives understand. So let's start with the hype. You probably know the story about the 6 blind men and the elephant. 6 blind men come across an elephant, and one grabs a leg and said, I found a tree, and the other one grabs the tail and says, I found a snake, and so on. And nowadays, everything seems to be DevOps. It seems to be the other way around. Whatever it is, mostly for nefarious commercial purposes, everything is turned into DevOps. So let's recognise that it is. You've got to be. If people say DevOps, what do they actually mean by it? So let's try and start defining it. Well, this is Patrick who coined the term. It started off in 2008-9. That's when he coined the term. He came up with the DevOps Days conferences. And he does some great writing on his blog, certainly a source of wisdom to keep an eye on that. He's recognised as the godfather behind DevOps. And this is another guy who you come across quite often, John Willis, who goes under the lovely Twitter handle of Botchagaloop. I don't know how he thought up that. He's worth following as well. He, together with a couple of other people, coined the abbreviation CAMS, which turned into CALMS. The lean was added to it later on. He does some good writing and talking as well. You can find plenty of stuff, John on YouTube. And if you're wondering, is Patrick particularly tall, or is John particularly small? If you want some frame of reference, then I think both are true. I had the pleasure of meeting John in Amsterdam a couple of years ago. This is a fairly old tweet. It's 2012. As I mentioned, he came up with the CAMS abbreviation, the Scenes for Culture. And he was fed up with people always talking about tools and automation, stuff like that. He said, nobody's paying attention to culture. So he just meant just to shake people up. I'm pulling the C out of CAMS. Nobody pays any attention to it anyway. I thought that was a nice statement. And culture is such an important part of DevOps. As you mentioned, Andre, it's not what people. It's more about what an organisation does, what a team of people do. Does anybody have a decent definition of what DevOps is? Anything that they could just reel off? Yeah.
It's a set of practices to streamline feedback from dev to prod and back.
Yeah, set of practices to streamline feedback from dev to prod and back. Yeah.
Break the silos.
Break the silos. Yeah. The DevOps community, particularly the people at the beginning, the inaugural They often call themselves the Illuminati, the enlightened ones, have been notoriously reluctant to define DevOps. And it's good and it's bad. The reluctance, I think, is the good part is if you define it, there's a likelihood that you'll kill something that's still in development. And that would be a bad thing because it's still emerging. So you've got to give it the opportunity to emerge. On the other hand, you have to recognize that DevOps has evolved into something that is picking up serious interest mainstream, and the marketplace, the community is looking for, what is this thing? Standardization, codification. And that is a little bit scary for some people. So there's quite a discussion within the DevOps community. How should we and how far should we go down the road of codifying, standardizing DevOps? John Willis came up with an interesting way of defining DevOps by defining what it isn't. If you define what something isn't, what are you left with? So Zen Buddhism, you're left with what it is, which is a great way of defining stuff. So he says, it's not all of this. You can read that on his blog. Gene Kim was mentioned here. We've added, just for the statistics on height of people, we've added Gene Kim here to the equation. I think this is a pretty good definition. It certainly builds on what you said. Gene says DevOps is a set of cultural norms and technical practices, and recently he's added architecture to that. Cultural norms, technical practices, architecture. And that really helped me in my understanding of what is DevOps. That help organizations do two things: get a fast flow of work from development through testing to production, deployment to production, while at the same time maintaining world-class reliability, stability, and stuff like that. So the balance that you mentioned. A couple of references to where that comes from. Architecture. I've always struggled with the word architecture. What is architecture as opposed to design? Where does architecture stop? Where does design begin? And I've got a sort of a working definition of architecture as the stuff that is practically irreversible, the choices that you make at the start of an adventure, possibly a project, that are extremely difficult to change further down the road. Fundamental stuff, I say that's architecture. And you could take the example, there seems to be a common theme in a couple of the containers, in a couple of presentations. You could say we have made a conscious decision, an architectural decision, to use containers as our way of doing stuff. Now I was playing with the concept of DevOps legacy. Just imagine we're five years further down the road, and we come across this situation that it's all collapsing. Containers, that seemed like such a good idea at the time, microservices. But have we gone too far? Are they too small? It was mentioned, I was very grateful to one of the speakers this morning mentioning you don't get rid of complexity, you just shift it around. Previously, I think I've written a blog called the Law of Conservation of Spaghetti. You can't get rid of complexity, you just shift it around. Pretend you can move it out of your own department, but somebody else is going to deal with it. So it's something to think about. What kind of things are we constructing, and are we going to be confronted in the future, or is somebody else going to be confronted in the future with technical debt? And it really depends on what you choose as your definition of done. If you don't think much about architecture long term, and have a fairly weak definition of done, then you're probably going to end up with a great amount of technical debt. Whereas if your definition of done was more robust, obviously it will cost you more, so it's a trade-off, short-term costs and long-term benefits, then you'd have much less. Fascinating topic this, and it's of course in enterprises, real-life enterprises, it's politics as well, because the manager who's responsible for the investment now possibly won't be the manager who's going to be confronted with the technical debt in the future. So, you know, you've got that to deal with as well. Lots of stuff reminds me of Dijkstra. Is this name familiar to you? A couple of people. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. One of my heroes. And if only he would have been around, lived long enough to be able to tweet, he would have had some great tweets, like this one: computing's core challenge is how not to make a mess of it. Now that is still extremely true. How not to make a mess of it. Take that to your heart. Somebody's taken the trouble to capture, to archive most of his writings. We call them blogs, but he just wrote them. His handwriting was quite exquisite. It's nice to see his handwriting. You can find it on the source at Texas University. They've captured this stuff. Makes very interesting reading if you've got some time on your hands. The Phoenix project was mentioned with the 3 ways, which are... Who's not familiar with the 3 ways? A couple of people? No? Okay, yeah. Yeah, very, very basic stuff in the DevOps world, that concept of one, thinking holistically, not about, in this case, not just about development, but looking downstream, thinking about the future, realizing that operations has got something to do, getting quick feedback so you can react and improve, and instilling a culture, fostering a culture that's all about continuous experimentation, taking risks, not having the illusion that you can make a fail-safe solution, but thinking in terms of safe-to-fail experiments, little experiments which, of course, a little bit risky, but you can justify the risk. And mastery, you mentioned a couple of times. Recently, I've added a fourth, well, it's not really a fourth way of DevOps. The DevOps cookbook, I say it was originally, it's not the cookbook, it's the handbook. The DevOps handbook is about to be published. I think they've got first half of October as the proposed publication date. And I'm not quite sure why I got it. I think because I expressed interest in the book. I got a 130-page first 2 chapters quite recently, and delighted with how it's looking. Just looking at the table of contents, they've got some great stuff there. And I've taken this 4th point from the table of contents. So not only looking at flow, feedback, and continual experimentation, but integrating stuff like information security, compliance, change management into the stuff that people do, instead of having it as separate silos, integrating it. And these are 4 categories that the DevOps handbook uses to categorize the technical practices. You remember I said cultural norms, technical practices, architecture. The technical practices you can categorize in these 4 categories. I did a little bit of research on. I was trying to categorize the technical practices myself before I got that preview of the book, and I came up with practically everything that starts with continuous probably has something to do with DevOps. And I've got here, it's got continuous delivery, continuous deployment here, continuous deployment where the deployment to production is automated, and if it's manual, then it's continuous delivery. Some very brief definitions of the topics. I've added rugged DevOps as something that somebody only recently pointed that out to me. That fits into the integrate information security, change management and compliance into development activities. Make sure it's not a separate. But these are examples of technical practices. I think the technical practices seem to be pretty narrow. They're focused on specific areas like continuous integration. If you look at the cultural norms, I think they're more broadly applicable. Things like continuous experimentation, you could apply everywhere within IT and also beyond IT. So, and referring back to DevOps being a bit of a hype, people often use the word DevOps very imprecisely. So if you want to really understand what is somebody talking about, it's a great idea to say, are you talking about the cultural norms? Are you talking about the technical practices? Because people are making ridiculous statements about DevOps versus whatever, but they fail to define what part of DevOps they're comparing with something else. So if you can think about DevOps in those terms of cultural norms, technical practices, and architecture, I think that's really helpful. Certainly helped me. Little question for you. If we take these as pretty basic activities that we do in IT, we specify requirements, we acquire stuff or build stuff, test it, deploy it, run it, support it in operations. I'm thinking about the relationship between DevOps and Agile, because they're often used as being part of the same broader family. How would you categorize the relationship between Agile and DevOps related to these activities? Would you say that Agile has a broader scope than DevOps? So DevOps addresses stuff that Agile also addresses? Would you say it's the other way around? DevOps has a broader scope and Agile is a subset within that? Would you say that there's an overlap, that Agile has its own world and DevOps has its own world, but there's a bit in between? Or would you say they're two separate domains? Well, let's think about that for half a minute and ask you for your hands for all four. Who'd say one? That's about maybe 10%. Who'd say two? I'd say that's 20%. Who'd say three? I'm 60, 70%. Who'd say four? Nobody. Yeah, I'm tending towards three as well, but it does very much depend. Are you talking about the technical practices in DevOps? Are you talking cultural norms? Would take it much broader. I found it quite just an interesting intellectual exercise for myself. Pleased to get your feedback as well on that, just to think about that relationship. This is a diagram you see a lot with Scrum. It sort of defines Scrum, lots of activities. The crucial part is it ends up with potentially shippable product increments. And the key word is potentially. Great, you're on a pallet waiting to be shipped, but they're not shipped yet. And I'd like to put that into a broader value chain. I've abbreviated some stuff here. I've got the DEM is demand, requirements, demand. Blue is business, green is IT, if you like that dividing the world into two. Demand, development, operations, and use. And it's one of my pet peeves that we don't spend enough time thinking about the use part, because that is the only part in the whole chain where value actually gets realized. If users don't use systems, no value has been realized. So all of the first three are just in order to get value out of the systems and services. You could put Agile probably here, overarching demand and development. And of course, that comment about potentially shippable is not shipped, it's got to be shipped, it's got to be deployed into operations. And DevOps, you could debate how broad, how wide the arrows should be, but I'm inclined to say that there's not much, certainly if you look at the technical practices, continuous integration, deployment, development, rugged, maybe a bit more. But most of the DevOps practices seem to start in development and not in the requirements, not in the demand stage. Does anybody think DevOps extends more to the left? Yeah, a couple of people, yeah. Yeah, that's just for understanding. I found it's useful to position these things on a value chain, and with the realization that there isn't an absolute definition. So there's a bit of elastic there. I've taken these four entities and I've positioned them slightly differently. I've added the distinction between information, applications, and infrastructure. From a business point of view, it's really about information. Applications are just a necessary evil to get information. That's what they want. And I've divided development and operations up into applications development and infrastructure development. I don't like the word infrastructure development. I think probably engineering would be better, but just for the sake of synchronicity. And keeping applications up and running and keeping infrastructure up and running, operations. I think that's a valid distinction. Of course, you could organise that together, but I think they're two different kinds of activities with different dynamics. And the arrows depict, we see here, the demand comes from what do we need, and the big arrows are delivery of stuff, and here you engineer or you develop the infrastructure that's needed both for development and for operations, so that infrastructure operations can provide developers and application operations with the infrastructure that they need to keep the applications up and running so that the users get the information that they need. That distinction between applications and infrastructures, I think, is pretty fundamental. And I've been thinking, I've called this shifting tectonic plates in IT. I'm wondering about the organisational consequences of how things are going. And I think that these two circles are separating. What I'm seeing is the applications part of IT and the business getting closer and closer together. And where, I think in the previous discussion, we touched on centralisation, possibly the word wasn't used, but the gentleman who asked the first question after what kind of organisation do you have? Do you have multiple IT departments, business departments? How do you organise IT? Centralisation, we've organised IT centrally. Why? Why do you organise stuff centrally? Usually it's because of three components that play a role. Either you have to, the external stakeholders demand that in enterprises that some things happen centrally. Directors are responsible for stuff that can't be done, it's a central responsibility. You centralise if you get significant benefit to either profit or market capitalisation. If you get 10% or more financial benefit, that is a decent justification for centralising stuff. And so either it's obligatory, and you get significant financial benefits, and there aren't significant risks in terms of, if you centralise stuff, you're running the risk that bureaucracy, distraction from the core stuff. If there aren't significant risks, and if you get a big financial benefit, then centralise. And possibly that was the case in the past. But I think now we're moving more into the digital enterprise where companies are using IT not just as a tool to improve their business productivity, but as an instrument to get competitive advantage. IT has moved from the agenda, from the basement of being something we need, to keep the lights on, to being something that really makes a difference. And I think that justifies decentralizing IT into the various lines of business. So if in your enterprise, if you've got 4 different lines of business, probably a big enterprise then, 4 different lines of business, I think you should have 4 different IT. I was tempted to say IT departments. I think you should have IT embedded in those 4 lines of business together with the business. So that distinction between I am a subservient IT provider, I'm your order taker, that has changed into I'm a co-worker, so you're working with the business. That's a completely different ballgame. I see that's something I'm seeing happening in this area. And with the increasing commoditization of IT, which is the natural way things go, and AWS Lambda was mentioned this morning, though these kind of developments isn't. If you look at like, this is a question mark behind this. If you look at the future, isn't it the natural way of things that these infrastructural components will be taken up by the marketplace? I don't know, but I've been playing around with this idea. I've plotted it. Has anybody come across Simon Wardley and his value mapping? He's worth keeping an eye on. Simon Wardley. Lots of people do stuff with his value mapping. He talks about the natural evolution of more or less whatever it is, but particularly technology. It starts off as its genesis, where it's born. First, it goes through a custom-built phase. Then it moves to the other side of the S-curve into a product which could be provided as a service, and finally a commodity. You could think about the various stuff that you deal with. Where is it on this scale? And is it, if it's more a commodity, can you justify doing it, having it in your own department? I've used another one of his diagrams to split our world into 2. The internal IT function on the left-hand side of this dotted line, and the external service providers on the other side. Applications, I think, because they're of such importance to the business, they have to be done within the business. But if you talk about infrastructure, commercial infrastructure services, increasingly done by external service providers, and if you think about the DevOps tooling, which some of you probably are spending an awful lot of time on in your own enterprise, so on the left-hand side, as that matures, as that follows that S-curve, it seems the natural state of affairs that in time will move towards the external marketplace. I'd like to debate this later on, if anybody's interested. But this just something to think about, and think about your future. If you are currently doing this kind of stuff within your building great tooling, where's your future? Is that going to remain in the enterprise, or is this going to move to the marketplace? I don't know. But it's certainly worth thinking about. Right, so that was some time spent on defining DevOps. I'd like to expand it slightly, with thanks to my good friend Dave Van Herpen, who's done a lot of work on DevOps and Agile and IT service management. He said, we talk about DevOps, but really it's about all of it's about security, architecture, support, it's about the business, it's about external service providers. So you really do have to think in a much broader way about the whole. And I love the characters of these. You've got, look at the architects. Hope nobody's insulted. Or maybe I do. And any vendors, any cowboys in the Elvis? Yeah, great, good stuff there. I do a fair bit of blogging. You've probably come across my name easily enough, and if you add DevOps to it, you'll come across a couple of blogs. I talked about I spoke about the 3 ways of DevOps, which everybody's familiar with. I've expanded that into 12 ways. Now, these are the 3 ways between DevOps. But I decided that there will be a prequel to DevOps, a DevOps prequel, something that happens before. So that's the relationship between demand and dev. I think you could equally apply those 3 basic principles within DevOps: holistic thinking, fast feedback, continuous experimentation and learning. You could apply that to the left-hand side as well. And of course, that is the area where Agile and Scrum fits in. Put that there. Of course, if you've got a prequel, you've got to have a sequel. So the sequel is the relationship between ops and the users. And I think it's a valid point. The relationship between IT operations and the users is in serious need of improvement. And DevOps has some great principles which you can adopt. So now, just diagrammatically, I'm just going to drop those arms down the bottom, which leaves us down the bottom with the business. We in IT often talk about the business. We often talk about the business as if it were one single unified entity. It ain't. Just as within IT we've got silos, within the business you've got silos as well. And usually the people who think up the stuff, the IT stuff that needs to be done, think up the requirements, when it finally gets delivered to business operations, you get the reaction within business operations. How on earth have they thought this up? Why did they think that we need? Don't they know what we do? And often management isn't fully aware of the practicalities of business operations. So I think that makes the case for a 4th application of the DevOps principles to unify the gap between business management, usually business management that formulates demand, and business operations. You've sort of got a circle of initiatives that go through these phases and get repeated and repeated. And I was particularly proud of this PowerPoint animation. It took me ages to come up. Oh yeah, there's a reference to that article. Another analogy which I'm quite keen on is using a road to represent IT architecture, IT governance. The road on which you've got a vehicle, a car in this case, that represents the IT supply function. If you work in an IT department or for an external IT service provider, you are in the business of making cars. But, of course, you sort of feel this coming. If you don't have drivers who are, in my terminology, responsible for demand, what kind of cars do we want, and use, then you're delivering something which has absolutely no value. So it's a case of balancing the drivers and the cars. And that's one of the areas that our ASL-BSL Foundation is keen on with our BSL framework is to, and you can get a free download of the book, which is really, it's the business's guide to IT. So if in your organizations you're confronted with drivers, IT drivers, who aren't fulfilling their part of the bargain, then this collection of best practices might be worth a look, because it's a question of having dancing partners who are equally competent. So get the business up to speed. Selling DevOps before we kill it. We had hot shit this morning. Now we've got serious shit. Significant investments go into IT and DevOps initiatives. And the question that I've been thinking about for quite a while, a couple of years now, is how do you sell DevOps to executive hair? And Bob Beecham, I had the pleasure of meeting him once, a friendly guy. He runs BNC, who do IT service management tooling. But he's got great executive hair and an executive smile. How on earth do you sell DevOps to somebody like this? How do you sell DevOps to these are challenges that IT people have in general. How do you sell initiatives? And I came up with this idea of an IT value chain. I mentioned that I'm self-employed. I used to work for Capgemini, where they developed a concept that they call benefits logic. So, reference to them here. If you could talk about a public organisation, but I'll take a private organisation just as an example. It's all about revenue, cost, and obviously profit. If you think about where revenue comes from, it comes from selling more stuff, selling stuff at higher prices, or introducing new products into the market, moving into a different area of business. That's where your revenue comes from. And cost, you could talk about capital expenditure and operational expenditure. This is executive management terminology. You could talk to managers this they understand. And then if you take it a bit further, you think, now how can we generate higher prices? On the one hand, we could build better products, but on the other hand, if you build better relationships with your customers, it's a proven fact, loyal customers are prepared to pay higher prices. Because you must trust, they know that they can rely on you. So that's a way of, and that probably also increases the sales as well. So it's just deconstructing this. How do you get lower operational costs? You make your business more efficient. How do you reduce your capital expenditure? Fewer or cheaper resources that you have to buy. Not a word of IT mentioned so far. But if you then think about how can IT contribute to these important things that you can communicate with business managers, you can build better IT systems. You can build IT systems that will support the relationships with your customers. You can build IT systems that will give you better products. If you deliver stuff, say for instance you're developing a new product to put on the marketplace, and the launch of that product depends on IT. If you could deliver the IT component quicker, then obviously you'll get a quicker, you'll be able to get the sales in quicker. So that improves the speed with which you'll get the return on that product. If you make your IT more reliable, fewer outages or shorter outages, that's certainly going to influence the relationship with your customers who have a digital experience with you. So you can imagine, this varies of course from case to case, but I'm sure that you can imagine in your particular organisation, you can see the lines between various systems and how they affect the bottom line. Much IT traditionally has been used to make processes more efficient or to get rid of people, fewer resources. The traditional role of IT. Of course, you could reduce the cost of IT as well. More efficient IT, fewer IT resources. That will influence the bottom line as well. But do you have any idea how much your enterprise spends on IT compared to what it spends on other stuff, buildings and the total cost of IT, including the people who run IT? And what sort of percentage are we talking about? Any idea? This is a normal reaction. People are unaware of. It varies an awful lot. If you're a Shell, oil, petroleum, then you're probably talking about 1 or 2%, maybe, because they spend stuff on oil tankers and stuff like that. It's insignificant. If you're in the financial industry, if you're an online bank just with online presence, it might be 30%. You're talking probably within a couple of, on average, 10, 15, 10%, something around that bandwidth. So you could reduce your IT costs, but on average, you'd be talking about 10%. So if you could reduce your IT cost by 10%, for the executive at the end of the line, that's 1% reduction, which possibly compared to the reduction he or she could make in the business by spending more on IT, that'd be a lot more. So the exercise that you could do is think about various IT improvement initiatives that you're working on at the moment, or thinking of working on, or trying to sell to IT executives, and try and work out, what am I actually doing with this initiative? Is it going to just reduce the cost of IT? Is it going to make it more reliable? Are we going to be able to deliver quicker, or will we be able to build better systems? Now, let's just, before we close it off and kill DevOps. Oh yeah, and sorry it's so low here, more predictable performance. You could also invest in more predictability. Let's take a look at the benefits of DevOps. And I'm referring to who's familiar with this? State of DevOps report? More of you should be, I think. Have a look at it. It's been done for 3, 4, 5 years now. Some great research on what's happening in the DevOps world, state of the nation, state of DevOps. And I'd like to focus on a couple of things. They talk about IT performance. And they talk about IT performance in terms of deployment frequency, lead time for changes, mean time to recover, and change failure rate. These are things that are associated with DevOps. And the other one I want to focus on is the ROI, return on investment of DevOps. Savings include the cost of downtime and the cost of excess rework, and the value includes the potential revenue and customers gained from releasing stuff earlier. If you can release a product earlier into the marketplace, then you get customers. So, with bearing these things in mind, I took a look at this very generic way of depicting the costs of IT and the benefits, the value of it. And I'd say that your DevOps initiative would make things more predictable. Yellow is what I've said, this is relevant to DevOps. A DevOps initiative will make things more predictable. It will probably make things more efficient and possibly reduce the investment, but I've put a question mark behind that. It will, by making things more reliable, certainly deliver quicker. The thing I'd like to challenge you with is I don't think investing in IT will help you come up with better IT functionality. Bit of a bold statement, but I think the benefits of DevOps are mainly deliver stuff quicker and make it more reliable, possibly cheaper. So you're look at that in your organization. If you invest in DevOps, you're going to make things more reliable, you're going to do things quicker. What kind of benefits are they going to have? And you'll have to explain that in those kind of terms to executive management to get buy-in, if you can do that. So it really depends. For instance, is speed really important to your enterprise? Bimodal IT was mentioned, the difference between the classic legacy systems, which are fairly stable, as opposed to the dynamic systems that the marketing department might use, for instance. People often now talk about, not about bimodal, but multimodal. It depends. So you've got to recognize what kind of systems do you have, what kind of business does it support. So your business case will vary from case to case. Right, let's get around to killing it. This is Dave van Herpen, by the way, who's much taller than he looks. Yes, that side. And this is where we came up with this this little presentation that I've shared with you. The first time I presented it was in China, funnily enough, the very start of the presentation. This was in Norway, did it together with Dave there. you can see a mystical kind of atmosphere. So kill DevOps. Speaking at conferences like this, I'm prepared for the rotten tomatoes to be, we could come up with a statement like that, kill DevOps, but it's not what you think. Is anybody familiar with Zen Buddhism? A little bit? The concept of a koan, a question that can't be answered. I think probably one of the most famous is, what is the sound of one-handed clapping? It gets you thinking. And there's a little story about monks, Zen Buddhist monks, on their road to enlightenment and awaking, sort of constant study and discovery. And there's a Zen Buddhist saying, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. Sounds very paradoxical. And it's the same, but why is that? Because you will never find the Buddha. If you think you found the Buddha, you haven't. You've got to keep searching, keep searching, keep searching. So that's the parallel with DevOps. Don't think that you can define the apps. We have now implemented DevOps. You'll never be able to. So, and a little reference to the blog I wrote on that. So everything I've talked about, you'll have to kill, I'm afraid. This was just a temporary blip in our consciousness. Just as long as you don't kill the elephant, then I think we'll all be fine. So with that, I think we're having a little break now. Feel free to get in touch, Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever. I'll be here until the end of the day. Thank you very much.